The nation held its breath for 4 months. Behind the towering gates of Windermere Palace, two of the most beloved figures in the kingdom of Aldoria had vanished from public view, leaving only whispered rumors and carefully worded palace statements about medical treatments and recovery periods. Queen Isabella, at 51, had been the people's champion for over 2 decades, the royal who rolled up her sleeves at charity events, who remembered the names of school children she met years before, who brought warmth to the ancient marble halls of monarchy. Crown Prince Alexander, her brother-in-law and heir to the throne, had been the steady hand guiding the kingdom through economic uncertainty and social change. Then came the diagnosis that shook the very foundation of the royal family. But what the public didn't know, what the palace guards whispered in hushed tones, and what the royal physicians documented in classified medical files, was that their battle wasn't just against a disease that had claimed too many lives. It was a fight that would test the bonds of family, challenge the very meaning of duty, and ultimately reveal what it truly means to serve a nation when you're fighting for your own life. Today, as the palace gates swing open for the first time in months, the world is about to witness a return that will change everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the price of wearing crown. This is not just a story of survival. It's the untold story of what happened behind those palace walls when the cameras stopped rolling and the real battle began. The morning of March 15th started like any other at Windermere Palace, but Queen Isabella knew it would be the last normal day of her life for a very long time. She stood at the tall windows of her private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens that her late mother-in-law had planted decades ago. The spring blooms were just beginning to show their faces, and Isabella found herself wondering if she would see them reach full flower. Dr. Margaret Thornfield had arrived at the palace at 7 in the morning, carrying with her a leather briefcase that seemed to weigh more than it should. Isabella had known Margaret since university. They had been roommates before Isabella's life took a dramatic turn when she fell in love with Prince Edmund. Now, 30 years later, Margaret was one of the kingdom's most respected oncologists, and Isabella was about to receive news that would change everything. "The tests are conclusive, Bella," Margaret said, using the childhood nickname that only a handful of people were allowed to speak aloud. "It's aggressive, but it's treatable. The survival rates have improved dramatically over the past few years." Isabella nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she had maintained through state dinners and diplomatic crises. But inside, her mind was racing. She thought of her 3 children, Princess Charlotte, who was studying medicine at Cambridge, Prince William, who was serving with the Royal Navy, and young Prince Henry, who was still in his final year at boarding school. She thought of her husband, King Edmund, who was currently on a diplomatic mission in Southeast Asia and wouldn't return for another week. "How long do we have before this becomes public knowledge?" Isabella asked, ever the strategist. "The medical team involved has signed strict confidentiality agreements. We can keep this contained as long as necessary. But, Isabella, we need to start treatment soon. Within the next 2 weeks, at the latest." Isabella walked to her desk and picked up a silver-framed photograph of her family taken the previous Christmas. They were all laughing at something Prince Henry had said, their faces bright with joy and completely unaware of what lay ahead. She set the photo down and turned back to Margaret. "I'll need to speak with Edmund first, and we'll need to coordinate with Crown Prince Alexander's medical team." Margaret's expression shifted slightly. "Alexander's situation is different, Isabella. His treatment plan is going to be much more intensive. The doctors are recommending immediate surgery, followed by months of chemotherapy and radiation." The weight of this news settled over Isabella like a heavy cloak. Crown Prince Alexander, Edmund's younger brother, had been diagnosed with cancer just 6 weeks earlier. The palace had managed to keep both diagnoses completely secret from the press and the public, but the strain was beginning to show on everyone involved. Alexander had always been the steady one in the family, the reliable brother who handled the duties that Edmund found tedious, who remembered every diplomat's birthday, and who could recite the agricultural statistics of every province in the kingdom. He was unmarried, having dedicated his life entirely to service, and had been preparing to take on even more responsibilities as Edmund aged. Now, at 48, he was facing the fight of his life. Isabella made her way through the palace corridors to Alexander's private quarters. The ancient stones seemed to echo with the weight of centuries of royal secrets, and she couldn't help but think about all the other crises that had been managed within these walls. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that wars and political scandals never could. She found Alexander in his library, surrounded by stacks of government papers and medical journals. He had been researching his condition obsessively, approaching his illness with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every other challenge in his life. "The doctors want to start my treatment next week," he said without looking up from his reading. "Surgery on Tuesday, if the blood work comes back clear." Isabella sat down across from him, noting how thin he had become over the past few weeks. "Margaret just confirmed my diagnosis. We're going to be going through this together, Alex." Alexander finally looked up, and Isabella saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before: vulnerability. For all his strength and dedication, Alexander had always carried himself with an almost impenetrable dignity. Now, facing the possibility of his own mortality, he looked almost young again, like the little boy who used to follow Edmund around the palace gardens, desperate to be included in his older brother's adventures. "The irony isn't lost on me," Alexander said with a bitter smile. "I've spent my entire life preparing to serve this kingdom, and now I might not live long enough to do it properly." "Don't talk like that," Isabella said firmly. "We're going to beat this. Both of us." Over the next several hours, they worked together to develop a plan that would allow them both to receive treatment while maintaining the stability of the monarchy. They would need to coordinate their schedules so that one of them could always handle essential royal duties. They would need to brief King Edmund thoroughly so he could take on additional responsibilities. Most importantly, they would need to prepare the children and the senior staff for what was coming. The hardest conversation came that evening when Edmund returned early from his diplomatic mission. Isabella had called him back using a coded message that indicated a family emergency, and he had immediately boarded the royal plane without explanation to his security detail or the diplomatic corps. Edmund found Isabella and Alexander waiting for him in the private family dining room, a small, intimate space where the royal family could eat together away from the formal state dining rooms. The room was warm and comfortable, filled with personal photographs and mementos from family vacations and state visits. It was here that they had shared countless meals, celebrated birthdays and holidays, and discussed the challenges of royal life. "Both of you?" Edmund asked quietly after they had explained the situation. His face had gone pale, and Isabella could see him trying to process the implications of what they were telling him. "The treatments will be intensive," Alexander explained. "Isabella's doctors are optimistic, but my case is more complicated. We're looking at months of treatment, possibly longer." Edmund sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. He had been king for 15 years, having inherited the throne when their father died unexpectedly of a heart attack. He had always relied on Isabella and Alexander to help him navigate the complexities of modern monarchy, and now he was facing the possibility of losing both of them. "What do we tell the children?" Edmund asked. "The truth," Isabella said without hesitation. "They're old enough to understand, and they have a right to know what's happening to their family." The next few days were a whirlwind of medical consultations, family meetings, and careful planning. Princess Charlotte flew back from Cambridge immediately, her medical studies giving her a unique perspective on her mother's and uncle's conditions. Prince William requested emergency leave from the Navy, and young Prince Henry was quietly brought home from school for what the palace described as family time. The family meetings were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Charlotte, at 23, took charge with a maturity that surprised everyone creating detailed schedules for treatments and recovery periods. William, just 21, struggled with the news, but channeled his emotions into helping coordinate security arrangements for the increased medical visits to the palace. Henry, at 18, was the most affected, breaking down completely when he learned that both his mother and his beloved uncle were seriously ill. "I should postpone university," Henry said during one family meeting. "I should stay here and help." "Absolutely not," Alexander said firmly. "The best way you can help is by continuing to live your life, by pursuing your education, by becoming the man you're meant to be. This family has survived much worse than this, and will survive this too." Dr. Margaret Thornfield worked closely with Alexander's medical team to coordinate their treatment schedules. Isabella's treatment would involve surgery followed by a moderate course of chemotherapy and radiation. Alexander's case was more complex. His tumor was larger and more aggressive, requiring immediate surgery followed by an intensive treatment regimen that would likely keep him out of public view for months. The palace communications team, led by Sir James Morrison, worked around the clock to develop a strategy that would protect both their privacy and the stability of the kingdom. They would need to gradually reduce Isabella's and Alexander's public appearances, citing scheduling conflicts and private family time. When the treatments became more intensive, they would announce that both were taking temporary leaves of absence for health reasons, without providing specific details. "The key is managing the narrative," Sir James explained during a late-night strategy session. "We need to control the information flow, provide enough transparency to maintain public trust, but protect their privacy during treatment. The last thing we need is paparazzi camping outside the medical center or wild speculation in the tabloids." As the first treatment date approached, Isabella found herself spending more and more time in quiet reflection. She walked through the palace gardens, visited her favorite rooms, and spent long hours with her children, trying to memorize every detail of these peaceful moments before the storm began. The night before her first surgery, Isabella couldn't sleep. She found herself in the palace chapel, a small, ancient room where generations of royals had prayed during times of crisis. The moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the stone floor, and Isabella felt the weight of history around her. She thought about all the queens who had come before her, who had faced their own challenges and tragedies with dignity and strength. She thought about the people of Aldoria, who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity in an uncertain world. She thought about her children, who would need to be strong in the months ahead. Most of all, she thought about Alexander, who would begin his own treatment just days after her surgery. They had always been close, but this shared battle was creating a bond between them that went deeper than family or duty. They were warriors now, fighting not just for their own lives, but for everything they represented. As dawn broke over Windermere Palace, Isabella made a silent promise to herself and to everyone who depended on her. She would face this challenge with the same grace and determination that had carried her through 2 decades of royal service. She would show her children how to face adversity with courage. She would prove that even queens could be vulnerable and still be strong. The battle was about to begin, and Isabella was ready. The private medical wing of St. Bartholomew's Hospital had been transformed into what the security team called a fortress of discretion. Dr. Sarah Chun, the hospital's chief administrator, had personally overseen every detail of the preparations. The entire 3rd floor had been cleared, with only essential medical staff granted access, each having undergone extensive background checks and signed agreements that carried criminal penalties for any breach of confidentiality. Isabella's surgery took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in early April. King Edmund paced the private waiting room like a caged animal, while Princess Charlotte sat nearby, alternately studying her medical textbooks and checking her phone for updates from the palace communications team. Prince William had positioned himself by the window, watching the street below for any signs of press activity, while young Prince Henry sat quietly in a corner, his usual teenage energy replaced by anxious stillness. Dr. Margaret Thornfield emerged from the operating theater after 3 hours, still wearing her surgical scrubs, but with a tired smile on her face. "The surgery went perfectly," she announced to the family. "We removed the entire tumor, and the preliminary pathology looks very encouraging. Isabella is strong, and she's going to recover beautifully." The relief in the room was palpable. Edmund embraced Margaret, tears streaming down his face, while Charlotte hugged her younger brothers. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to feel hopeful. But their celebration was short-lived. Alexander's surgery was scheduled for the following week, and his prognosis was far more uncertain. His tumor was located in a more complex area, and his surgical team had warned the family that the procedure could take anywhere from 6 to 10 hours, depending on what they found once they began operating. Isabella's recovery, meanwhile, progressed exactly as Margaret had predicted. Within days, she was walking the hospital corridors, chatting with nurses, and insisting on reviewing palace correspondence from her hospital bed. Her natural warmth and resilience impressed everyone on the medical staff, and several nurses later said that caring for Queen Isabella had been the highlight of their careers. "She remembered everyone's names," said Nurse Patricia Williams years later. "She asked about our families, our children, our lives outside the hospital. Even when she was feeling terrible from the chemotherapy, she would ask how we were doing. She made us feel like the important ones." Alexander's surgery took place on a Thursday, and from the beginning, it was clear that this was going to be more challenging than Isabella's procedure. Dr. Michael Harrison, one of Europe's leading neurosurgeons, led a team of 8 specialists in what would become a 9-hour operation. The family maintained their vigil in the waiting room, joined now by Isabella, who had insisted on being discharged early so she could support her brother-in-law during his surgery. When Dr. Harrison finally emerged from the operating theater, his expression was cautiously optimistic but serious. "We were able to remove most of the tumor," he explained to the gathered family. "However, its location made complete removal impossible without risking significant neurological damage. Alexander will need aggressive follow-up treatment, chemotherapy, and radiation, and we'll need to monitor him very closely over the next several months." The next phase of treatment was even more challenging than the surgeries. Isabella's chemotherapy sessions were scheduled twice a week, and while her treatments were relatively mild compared to Alexander's, they still left her exhausted and nauseated. She lost her hair gradually, first in small amounts that she tried to hide with careful styling, then more rapidly until she finally decided to shave it off completely. "I'm starting a new fashion trend," she joked to her children during one of their regular family video calls. She had taken to wearing colorful silk scarves that Margaret had brought her from a specialty boutique in London. Who needs hair anyway? But behind her cheerful facade, Isabella was struggling more than she let on. The treatments made her feel weak and foggy-headed, and there were days when she could barely get out of bed. The hardest part was watching Alexander endure treatments that were far more severe than her own. Alexander's chemotherapy regimen was brutal. The medications left him violently ill, unable to keep food down for days at a time. His characteristic dignity and composure cracked under the physical strain, and there were moments when he wondered if the treatment was worse than the disease itself. His medical team had warned the family that the next few months would test Alexander's will to live, and they weren't exaggerating. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Alexander's oncologist, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had seen hundreds of patients through similar battles. She had warned Alexander from the beginning that his treatment would require every ounce of mental and physical strength he possessed. "Some days you're going to want to quit," she told him during one of their early consultations. "You're going to feel like the treatment is killing you faster than the cancer ever could. But I need you to trust the process and trust your body's ability to heal. We've seen remarkable recoveries in cases similar to yours, but only when patients commit completely to the treatment plan." The Palace Communications team, meanwhile, was working overtime to manage the growing speculation about the royal family's unusual absence from public events. Sir James Morrison found himself walking a tightrope between honesty and privacy, providing just enough information to satisfy public curiosity while protecting Isabella and Alexander's medical details. The official statement spoke of routine medical procedures and temporary adjustments to royal schedules. When pressed by persistent journalists, Sir James would only say that both Queen Isabella and Crown Prince Alexander were receiving excellent medical care and would return to public duties when their doctors cleared them for full activity. But managing the press was becoming increasingly difficult. Royal watchers had noticed that neither Isabella nor Alexander had been seen in public for over 2 months, and photographers were stationed outside every major hospital in London, hoping to catch a glimpse of royal visitors or medical transportation. The breakthrough came in June, during Alexander's 5th week of intensive chemotherapy. His medical team had been monitoring a particular marker in his blood work, and the numbers had been steadily improving. Dr. Walsh called the family to the hospital for what she described as a significant update. "The tumor is responding better than we had hoped," she announced to the assembled family. "The combination of surgery and chemotherapy has reduced the remaining cancer cells by 75%. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is the best news we could have hoped for at this stage of treatment." Isabella, who had been receiving her own treatments on an outpatient basis, grabbed Alexander's hand and squeezed it tightly. For the first time since their ordeal began, Alexander smiled, really smiled, and the family felt hope returning. The summer months brought a gradual improvement in both their conditions. Isabella completed her chemotherapy treatments in July and began the radiation phase of her treatment. The daily sessions were less debilitating than the chemotherapy had been, and she found herself slowly regaining her energy and optimism. Alexander's improvement was more dramatic. By August, his blood work showed no detectable cancer cells, and his doctors began talking about remission. The transformation in his physical appearance was remarkable. The gaunt, exhausted man who had entered treatment was gradually being replaced by someone who looked more and more like the Alexander they all remembered. But the months of treatment had changed both of them in ways that went beyond their physical recovery. Isabella found that her perspective on royal duty had evolved during her illness. The formal protocols and ceremonial obligations that had once seemed so important now felt less significant compared to the genuine human connections she had discovered during her treatment. "I used to think that being queen meant being perfect all the time," she confided to Margaret during one of her follow-up appointments. "Never showing weakness, never admitting uncertainty. But going through this has taught me that vulnerability can be a strength too. People don't need their queen to be invincible. They need her to be human." Alexander's transformation was even more profound. The man who had dedicated his entire life to duty and service had been forced to confront his own mortality and consider what really mattered to him. During the long weeks of treatment, he had reconnected with old friends, explored interests he had never had time for, and begun to think about what he wanted from the rest of his life. "I spent 48 years preparing to serve," he told Isabella during one of their regular walks through the palace gardens as summer turned to autumn. "But I never spent any time thinking about what it means to live." The medical team began discussing the possibility of a gradual return to public duties. Both Isabella and Alexander were responding well to their treatments, and their doctors felt cautiously optimistic about their long-term prognosis. But the palace communications team wanted to manage their return carefully, ensuring that their first public appearances would be meaningful and positive. By October, both Isabella and Alexander were declared to be in remission. Their medical teams would continue to monitor them closely, and they would need regular follow-up treatments, but the acute phase of their battle was over. They had survived, and they had done so with their dignity and their dedication to service intact. The decision about when and how to return to public life became a family affair. King Edmund, who had carried the full weight of royal duties for months, was eager to have his wife and brother back at his side. The children, who had watched their mother and uncle fight the battles of their lives, were proud and relieved to see them healthy again. But Isabella and Alexander knew that their return would be more than just a resumption of their previous roles. They had been changed by their experience, and they wanted their public service to reflect the lessons they had learned during their months away from the spotlight. The palace announced that Queen Isabella and Crown Prince Alexander would make their first joint public appearance in early November at the annual Remembrance Day ceremonies. The symbolism was intentional, a day dedicated to honoring those who had served, and sacrifice seemed like the perfect occasion for their return to public service. As November approached, both Isabella and Alexander felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about returning to public life. They had spent months focused entirely on their health and their family, and the prospect of once again taking up the mantle of royal duty felt both familiar and foreign. But they also felt a sense of purpose that was deeper and more meaningful than anything they had experienced before their illness. They had faced the ultimate test of human resilience and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to serving the people of Aldoria. The morning of November 11th dawned crisp and clear over London, with autumn sunlight filtering through the bare branches of the trees lining the ceremonial routes. At Windermere Palace, Queen Isabella stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting a simple black hat over hair that had grown back in soft silver curls, shorter than she had ever worn it, but somehow more flattering than her previous style. "Are you ready for this?" King Edmund asked, appearing beside her in the reflection. He was already dressed in his formal military uniform, medals gleaming across his chest, but his eyes held the same mixture of pride and protectiveness that had sustained their family through the darkest months of the year. Isabella smiled, touching the small golden pin that Margaret had given her, a medical caduceus surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the light. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Down the hall, Crown Prince Alexander was making his own final preparations. The months of treatment had left him thinner than before, but there was a vitality in his eyes that hadn't been there even before his illness. His valet, Thomas, who had served the royal family for over 30 years, was brushing an invisible speck from Alexander's uniform jacket. "If I may say so, Your Royal Highness," Thomas said quietly, "you look stronger than ever." Alexander caught Thomas's eye in the mirror. "I feel it, Thomas. For the first time in my life, I feel truly strong." The royal motorcade that departed Windermere Palace that morning was different from the formal processions that had carried the family to state events in the past. Instead of the usual distance between the royals and their security detail, there was an intimacy, a sense of shared purpose that hadn't existed before. Isabella and Alexander rode together in the lead car, with Edmund and the children following closely behind. As they made their way through the streets of London, crowds began to gather along the route. Word had spread through social media and news outlets that the Queen and Crown Prince would be making their first public appearance since their mysterious absence, and people were genuinely excited to see them again. "Look at all these people," Isabella murmured, waving through the car window at the growing crowds. "They waited for us." "They love you," Alexander replied. "They always have, but I think they love you even more now." People recognize authenticity, Bella. They can sense when someone has been through something real. The cenotaph stood at the heart of London's government district, surrounded by the imposing buildings that housed the machinery of democracy. But on Remembrance Day, it became something more sacred, a focal point for a nation's gratitude, and a symbol of the sacrifices that had preserved their freedom. When the royal car pulled up to the ceremonial area, Isabella felt her heart racing. She had attended dozens of Remembrance Day ceremonies over the years, but this felt entirely different. She was no longer just fulfilling a duty. She was joining a community of people who had faced their own battles and emerged with a deeper understanding of what service really meant. The crowd's reaction when Isabella and Alexander stepped from their car was immediate and overwhelming. A spontaneous cheer went up from the thousands of people gathered around the cenotaph, and Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. She had expected polite applause, the usual respectful reception that greeted royal appearances. Instead, she was hearing something that sounded like genuine celebration. "Your Majesty, welcome back," someone called from the crowd, and others took up the cry. "We missed you. So glad you're well. Welcome home." Isabella and Alexander walked slowly through the cordoned area, stopping to speak with veterans, military families, and members of the public who had gathered for the ceremony. What struck both of them was how naturally the conversations flowed. People weren't just being polite. They were genuinely interested in their well-being, sharing their own stories of illness and recovery, and expressing gratitude not just for their return, but for the example they had set. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 82-year-old widow whose husband had served in the Royal Navy, grasped Isabella's hand with surprising strength. "Your Majesty, my daughter went through cancer treatment last year. Knowing that you were fighting the same battle gave her such courage. She said if the Queen could do it, so could she." Isabella squeezed the elderly woman's hand, feeling the weight and wonder of connection that went far deeper than royal protocol. "How is your daughter now?" "She's in remission, Your Majesty. Just like you. She's here somewhere in the crowd. She wouldn't miss seeing you today for anything." Similar conversations were happening around Alexander. Veterans who had faced their own health battles, young people dealing with family illnesses, healthcare workers who had followed the royal family's journey through carefully worded palace statements, and hospital rumors. All of them seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed during those 4 months of absence. Colonel James Mitchell, a decorated Afghanistan veteran who now worked with wounded service members, approached Alexander during a quiet moment in the pre-ceremony gathering. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for something you probably don't even know about." Alexander turned his full attention to the colonel, a habit he had developed during his treatment when every conversation felt precious and meaningful. "During your treatment, word got around among our wounded veterans that you were going through something serious," Colonel Mitchell continued. "We didn't know the details, of course, but we knew it was significant. Some of our guys who were struggling with their own recovery started calling it the Alexander Challenge. If the Crown Prince could keep fighting his battle, they could keep fighting theirs. It became a rallying cry, sir. You helped people you never met." Alexander was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. Throughout his treatment, he had been so focused on his own struggle and his family's needs that he hadn't fully considered how his battle might affect others. The realization that his private fight had somehow provided strength to people facing their own challenges was both humbling and inspiring. The ceremony itself was deeply moving, but what made it extraordinary was the sense of shared experience that permeated every moment. When Isabella and Alexander laid their wreaths at the base of the cenotaph, they weren't just honoring the military dead. They were acknowledging everyone who had fought battles of their own. During the 2 minutes of silence, Isabella found herself thinking not just about fallen soldiers, but about all the people she had met during her treatment. The nurses who worked double shifts, the other patients who had become friends, the family members who had maintained hope when hope seemed impossible. She thought about Dr. Margaret Thornfield and Dr. Jennifer Walsh and all the medical professionals who fought battles against disease with the same courage that soldiers brought to conventional warfare. Alexander's thoughts during the silence went to the letters that had been forwarded to him during his treatment. Palace staff had carefully screened thousands of messages from well-wishers, but they had passed along hundreds of letters from people facing their own health crises, people who had found inspiration in knowing that even members of the royal family were not immune to life's challenges. When the ceremony concluded, the royal family was scheduled to attend a private reception for veterans and military families. But as they made their way through the crowd, both Isabella and Alexander found themselves lingering, reluctant to retreat behind palace walls after months of isolation. "We should do a walkabout," Isabella said suddenly to the security team. "Properly. like we used to do. Sir David Pemberton, the head of royal security, looked nervous. Walkabouts required extensive planning and coordination, and this was supposed to be a carefully controlled return to public duties. But he could see the energy in both Isabella and Alexander, and he recognized that something important was happening. "We can arrange something informal," he agreed. "A few minutes along the barriers, perhaps." Those few minutes stretched into nearly an hour as Isabella and Alexander moved slowly through the crowds, shaking hands, listening to stories, and reconnecting with the people they served. The conversations were extraordinary in their honesty and depth. People shared their own experiences with illness, talked about family members who had inspired them, and expressed genuine affection for the royal family in ways that transcended traditional deference. Sarah Chun, a young mother from Manchester who had traveled to London specifically to see the royal return, summed up what many were feeling. "They've always been our queen and prince, but now they feel like they're truly one of us. They've been through what real people go through, and they came back stronger." That means something. The media coverage of the day was overwhelmingly positive, but it was different from the usual respectful reporting that accompanied royal events. Journalists seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something historically significant, not just the return of two beloved royal figures, but a transformation in the relationship between the monarchy and the people. BBC royal correspondent Victoria Sterling, who had covered the royal family for over 15 years, later wrote, "I have attended hundreds of royal engagements, but I have never seen anything like the connection between the crowds and the royal family that day. It wasn't just respect or tradition. It was genuine love and mutual recognition of shared human experience." In the days following the Remembrance Day ceremony, the palace was flooded with letters, emails, and social media messages from people around the world. Many were from individuals facing their own health battles who had been inspired by Isabella and Alexander's journey. Others were from healthcare workers who felt honored that the royal family had experienced firsthand the challenges and triumphs of medical treatment. Dr. Margaret Thornfield found herself invited to speak at medical conferences around the world about the psychological and social aspects of treating high-profile patients. Her message was always the same. Cancer doesn't recognize titles or status. Queen Isabella faced exactly the same fears, challenges, and treatment side effects as any other patient. What made her special wasn't her royal status. It was her determination to face her illness with honesty, courage, and grace. The transformation in Isabella's and Alexander's approach to royal duty became evident in the weeks following their return. Isabella's first major solo engagement was at a newly opened cancer treatment center, where she spent hours talking with patients and their families, sharing her own experience in ways that would have been unthinkable before her illness. "The worst part isn't the treatment," she told a group of newly diagnosed patients during an informal gathering. "It's the fear of the unknown, the feeling that your life is completely out of your control. But I learned that you can't control the illness. You can only control how you respond to it. And you're stronger than you think you are. We all are." Alexander's return to duty was equally transformative. His first major engagement was at a veterans rehabilitation center, where he launched a new initiative focused on supporting service members dealing with long-term health challenges. His speech that day was unlike anything he had delivered before. Personal, emotional, and deeply authentic. "I spent my entire adult life preparing for service," he told the gathered veterans and their families. "But it took facing my own mortality to understand what service really means. It's not about duty or obligation. It's about connection, about recognizing that we're all fighting battles of one kind or another, and that none of us has to fight alone." The months that followed brought a steady stream of engagements that reflected their new priorities and perspectives. Isabella became a patron of several cancer research organizations and began working closely with medical schools to improve training in patient communication and care. Alexander expanded his work with veterans organizations and became a vocal advocate for mental health awareness and support. But perhaps most importantly, both of them brought a new authenticity to every aspect of their royal duties. The formal distance that had traditionally characterized royal engagements gave way to genuine warmth and connection. They remembered names, followed up on conversations, and created an atmosphere where people felt comfortable sharing their own stories and challenges. King Edmund watched these changes with a mixture of pride and amazement. They become better royals by becoming more human, he confided to Sir James Morrison during one of their regular briefings. They always cared about people, but now they understand what it means to need other people. That's made all the difference. As Christmas approached, Isabella and Alexander both received clean bills of health from their medical teams. The cancer was gone, their treatments had been successful, and their long-term prognoses were excellent. But both of them knew that their real recovery had been about more than just overcoming illness. They had discovered that vulnerability could be a source of strength, that admitting fear and uncertainty didn't diminish their ability to serve. It enhanced it. They had learned that the most profound connections happen when people share their struggles as well as their triumphs. On Christmas morning, as the extended royal family gathered for their traditional breakfast, Isabella looked around the table at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. King Edmund, who had carried extra responsibilities with grace and steadiness throughout their ordeal. Princess Charlotte, who had balanced her medical studies with caring for her family. Prince William, who had requested additional leave to be present for the most difficult treatments. Prince Henry, who had grown from a teenager into a young man during the months of crisis. And Alexander, her partner in the most challenging battle either of them had ever faced, who had emerged not just as a survivor, but as someone who understood that true strength comes from acknowledging weakness. "I want to propose a toast," Isabella said, raising her glass of orange juice. "To the year that taught us what we're really made of. To the people who stood by us when we needed them most. And to the future, which looks brighter than ever because we're facing it together." As glasses clinked around the table, Isabella felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The cancer diagnosis that had seemed like a devastating end had actually been a beginning, the start of a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve, to love, and to live with purpose and authenticity. The palace gates were open again. The royal standard flew proudly over Windermere Palace, and Queen Isabella and Crown Prince Alexander had returned to public life. But more than that, they had returned as changed people, stronger, wiser, and more connected to the people they served than they had ever been before. Their 4-month absence had been necessary for their physical healing, but their return marked the beginning of something even more important. A new chapter in royal service based not on perfection and distance, but on honesty, connection, and the shared recognition that everyone, regardless of title or status, is fighting battles that require courage, hope, and the support of others. The nation that had waited patiently for their return had gotten back more than just their beloved queen and crown prince. They had gotten leaders who truly understood what it meant to be human, to struggle, to persevere, and to emerge from darkness in a light with newfound purpose and unshakable strength.